everybody who have joined us in this webinar. As a protocol for webinars, virtual meetings, please keep your microphones on a mute format. You may raise hands as well as put your questions on the chat box as the seminar proceeds. Welcome to our guest from Japan, Sachio Nakato Sensei. He would be today talking to us on Japan-South Korea relations. Japan-South Korea relations, as most neighboring relations, is a complex one, and it sunk to its lowest point in 2018 due to the Supreme Court ruling with respect to comfort women. Historical issues of comfort women and forced labor continues to impinge on this relationship. Further, economic issues like in 2019, the trade disruption because of Japan regarding resale of strategic goods by South Korea to North Korea had caused further deterioration. However, when you look at the current move from especially President Biden in forming the alliance system, this relationship is going to draw a lot of attention. Moon has been in a reconciliatory mode and in March had even proposed for a summit meet and agreed to cooperate with Japan on future initiative. However, Japan has been on a more of a drawing lines working at the multilateral level than at the bilateral level, and has currently, for instance, vowed to work with a coordinated effort on COVID-19 in the trilateral meet between Beijing, Seoul, and Japan, and has also participated in a military exercise with the US and Seoul in Alaska. A significant concern for these two nations has also been its neighbor, North Korea, and the nuclear threat that North Korea proposes to play in during their many international outings that North Korea has in this particular area. The modus operandi of these nations is much desired in curtailing North Korea's ventures and adventures. Why is Japan therefore reluctant to move forward in a bilateral relations is probably one thing that we would get a good understanding of from Professor Nakato, who is today our honored guest. He's a professor at the College of International Relations and a director of Center for East Asian Studies, Peace and Cooperation Studies in Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan. His research interest, as you could well understand, is in the Northeast Asian security and international relations, North Korea's foreign policy, Japan's policy towards North Korea Peninsula. His articles have been recently appeared in journals such as International Journal of Korean Unification Studies, Journal of East Asian Affairs, Pacific Focus, and Korean Observers, among others. He's also been a visiting professor at the School of International Services in American University in 2002, 3, followed by 12, 14, and 19. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to invite you to be a speaker out here with us. I would request you to keep your presentations to around half an hour before we take questions from the audience. I look forward to a very vibrant discussion on an area that is of great concern right now. So I would now ask Nakato Sensei to take over. As you will have some slides to share, I presume.
Yes.
Do you need some assistance?
I think I can manage it, I hope. Yes. Yeah. Let's see.
Yes, so you'll just have to start your screen share again. I think you stopped it last time. So if you could just start it again.
Okay. Yes, this is my slide. Okay.
No, I don't think you've started the screen share, sir.
Okay, let's see.
Nakato Sensei, you have a green button at the bottom next to the chat.
Yes.
First, you open your slide on your computer desk.
Again.
Yeah.
How is it?
It's there.
Okay.
Great. If you could just press that button again so we could go to full screen. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction and also giving me a wonderful opportunity to share my understanding regarding Japan-local relations. So today's my talk is based on the published article in Pacific Focus last year, but I'm pretty sure that recent development between Japan and South Korea, many people are interested in. I'm not really discussing about this recent development, but I'm very glad to answer your question, even though my presentation itself does not cover the recent development. Okay, today my topic is security cooperation between Japan and South Korea, and especially on the North Korean nuclear and missile threat. I'd like to focus on two specific aspects. One is strategic priorities, and also another is historical aspect. Many people are expert both in Japan and South Korea. They argue the need for cooperation between Japan and Korea. However, and especially in the field of security, they have not successfully maintained security cooperation between the two countries. So my question is why? Okay, if you look at this picture, it shows that the level of security cooperation between Japan and ROK. There are three lines here. First one is high-level talks. High-level talks means ministry level visit between Japan and South Korea. So in 2013, for example, it has only once. On the other hand, 2017, 6 mutual meetings or mutual visit conducted. And the next line is called unit level cooperation. Unit level cooperation means joint exercise between Japan and South Korea. There are some joint exercise between the two countries. And the last one is showing the US allocate Japan trilateral cooperation. So interestingly, in 2013, it had only twice, but 2017, it had 12 times meetings among 3 defense establishments. On the other hand, in 2018, it dropped suddenly. And in 2019, actually, all these cooperation dropped even further. I am not saying that this picture completely shows the level of security cooperation, only show a kind of tendency. I collected, I counted the number from a reference section of a defense white paper published by Ministry of Defense in Japan. It only shows the tendency how Japan allocates security cooperation has changed. If you look at this picture, we could ask one research question. While Japan and ROK security cooperation remains stagnated, following the third nuclear test by North Korea on February 12, 2013, the two countries dramatically improved their security cooperation after North Korea conducted its fourth nuclear test on January 6. Or in other words, we could ask, why did security cooperation between Japan and South Korea differ following the third and fourth nuclear test by North Korea? Okay, again, 2013, North Korea conducted the third nuclear test. Even though both Japan and South Korea clearly expressed that there are a security threat from North Korea, but their cooperation level just remained very stagnated. But on the other hand, North Korea conducted fourth nuclear test in January 2016. Their security level overall improved suddenly. So I tried to explain the different response between Japan and South Korea regarding the third and fourth nuclear test. And I have established analytical framework focusing on one strategic priorities. So what that strategic priority means. So in this presentation, I defined strategic priorities as a preferred plan of action ranked by a country's importance to effectively achieve its strategic interests. So in case of Japan and South Korea strategy regarding North Korean policy, I focused on two specific strategies. The number one is dialogue and pressure. Japan's North Korean policy is basically adapted dialogue and pressure. Sometimes dialogue more emphasized and pressure is more emphasized. The second strategy I focused is US allocate Japan security cooperation. In Japan's North Korean policy, US allocate trilateral security cooperation has been one of the most important strategies to deal with North Korean nuclear issue. Both Japan and South Korea basically agree these strategies. But on the other hand, South Korea recently had other options as well, which is allocate China strategic cooperative partnership. So sometimes South Korea emphasized more on US allocate security alliance along with allocate China strategic cooperative partnership over US allocate Japan security cooperation. But recently it has been changing. Japan started to emphasize more on, as Jim mentioned, a multilateral security or international cooperation over Japan allocate or US allocate Japan security cooperation. It's a new trend actually. So here I focused on whether or not strategic priorities are converged or diverged. So in this section, the definition, I defined that convergence of strategic priorities signify the extent to which Japan and South Korea prioritize a common strategy with reference to North Korea over other strategies through political coordination. So practically speaking, when Japan and South Korea both emphasize dialogue over pressure, we could argue that this is the situation of convergence of strategic priority. Or US allocate Japan security cooperation has been promoted over other strategies that we can define that situation as the convergence of strategic priorities. On the other hand, divergence of strategic priority is defined at the extent to which Japan and South Korea prioritize opposing strategies with regarding to North Korea. So for example, Japan emphasized pressure over dialogue, while South Korea dialogue over pressure. In that situation, strategy of each country has been considered as diverged. Another aspect of analytical framework is a question of how to deal with history issues. I followed the traditional definition defined by Professor Robert Cohen long time ago. Discord here means that a situation in which government regard each other's policy as hindering the attainment of their goals and hold each other's responsibility for these constraints. So discord over history issues, for example, occurred when the local government demanded that the Japanese government take further steps to address the comfort women issue, and Japan rejected the demand by claiming that this issue is already settled. In that situation, discord continued. On the other hand, Japan and South Korea can cooperate over history issues. For example, the Comfort Women Agreement, concluded in December 2013, is considered as an example of cooperation between Japan and South Korea, even though the issues had not been completely resolved. As long as Japan and South Korea adjust their behavior to the interests of others through policy coordination. So my argument is defining factors for security cooperation between Japan and South Korea is determined by the combination of these factors. Okay, so based on this, I propose two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. When Japan and ROK strategic priorities diverge and discord over historical issue is continued, security cooperation is likely to remain low. And hypothesis 2, this is completely the opposite situation of hypothesis 1. So when Japan and ROK strategic priorities continue to converge and the cooperation over historical issues is maintained, security cooperation is likely to develop and remain high. I've got two other interaction possibilities we can think about. The one is when Japan and ROK strategic priorities continue to diverge, but cooperation over historical issue is maintained, security cooperation is likely to stagnate. So I call it DC. And the last possibility is when the Japan and ROK strategic priority converge with continued discord over historical issues. The latter is likely to disrupt security cooperation. But in my discussion, priority should be placed over convergence, divergence of strategic priority over cooperation discord in historical issues, since the former is a driving force for security cooperation, while the latter is more likely a break or non-break for cooperation. Therefore, the security cooperation levels between the two countries will be CC, CD, DC, DD in order. Then I'd like to discuss a little bit about specific cases from February 2013 to December 2015. So from February 2013 to December 2015, Japan allocated strategic priorities diverged and discarded over historical issues. So DD is the situation of the two countries, the lowest level of cooperation. If you look at strategic priorities during this period, from 2013 to 2014, South Korea prioritized the China allocated strategic cooperative partnership over US allocated Japan trilateral cooperation in dealing with North Korean nuclear issue. Actually, the President Park emphasized three-way strategic discussions between South Korea, the United States, and China over US allocated Japan trilateral cooperation in dealing with North Korean nuclear issues, while Japan regarded the traditional trilateral security cooperation as critical. So strategic priorities that diverged. And also, discord over historical issues prevented them from developing security cooperation during this period. South Korean leaders were suspicious of Japanese political leaders' historical perceptions and their statement, and considered Japan's behavior as an obstacle in their trilateral cooperation with the United States. At that time, President Park clearly mentioned that until the trust is recovered, security cooperation will not be possible. So as a result, the Japan-Allocated security cooperation did not fully develop, although they shared a common threat perception after North Korea's third nuclear test and missile test. And next period, from January 2016 to December 2016, during this period, convergence in the Japan-Allocated strategic priorities and a cooperation over historical issues were established and maintained from January 2016. So regarding history issue, the two countries, as everybody knows, reached an agreement regarding the comfort zone issue in December 2015. There are some criticism, opposition to the agreement, especially in South Korea and some in Japan, but still it created a conducive environment for security cooperation between the two nations. And regarding the question of strategic priority, the Park administration actually adjusted its strategic approach from the so-called China-oriented diplomatic strategy to a more traditional approach, meaning US allocate Japan trilateral cooperation in dealing with North Korean nuclear issues. Of course, this adjustment does not imply that South Korea dismissed China to move toward cooperation with Japan. Well, according to newspaper report, President Park called President Xi Jinping right after North Korea conducted a fourth nuclear test in January 2016. But President Xi Jinping did not answer, did not pick up the phone call from President Park, and 1 month needed until the summit talks actually occurred. So South Korea adjusted its policy, and South Korea even decided to introduce THAAD to deal with North Korean nuclear problem, which makes China be really angry with this change. Okay, then current issues. From January 2017 to present, we can divide this period into two different situations. During the first year of President Moon administration, even though different attitudes remain between Japan and South Korea regarding the comfort women issue, but President Moon and Prime Minister Abe agreed to maintain cooperation over the North Korean nuclear issue. So during the Moon Jae-in's government's first year, Japan and South Korea continued cooperation over history issues and their respective countries' strategic priorities converged regarding the North Korea. So their security cooperation maintained high in 2017. The first summit was actually conducted in 2017, and both leaders agreed to separate history issues from other relations between the two countries. We call it a two-track approach in South Korea-Japan relation. And 2017, North Korea conducted 2 nuclear tests one in September. Therefore, South Korea and government also emphasized trilateral cooperation among three countries in dealing with North Korean issues, nuclear issues. On the other hand, from 2018, Japan ROK security cooperation dropped because their strategic priorities diverged and historical issues again discarded. Regarding strategic priorities, after Chairman Kim Jong-un, the New Year speech, South Korea started to have active dialogue between the South and North, and President Trump and Chairman Kim had a historic summit meeting in June 2018. South Korea promoted more dialogue than pressure, while Japan still suspicious about North Korea's intention of denuclearization. Therefore, Japan continued to emphasize more on pressure over dialogue. So their strategic priorities are diverse. And before the lecture started, as our chairman mentioned, South Korea's Supreme Court ruling over the forced labor issue, Japan completely rejected. It is the violation of Japan's South Korean basic treatment, and Indian government also started to review the agreement over comfort women issues, and they did not ask Japan to renegotiate, but they actually called Japan to take more positive action over the issue, because the agreement concluded in 2015 did not reflect the victims' interest at all. Okay, there are alternative explanations to talk about Japan-South Korea cooperation and conflict. The most well-known or pioneering model is called quasi-alliance model, developed by Victor Cha, Georgetown University. He argued that security cooperation between Japan and South Korea may not develop, even though they share the common threat perception, in this case, North Korea or China, as long as the security of the two allies is guaranteed by the United States. So in his discussion, the defining factor is not whether or not Japan and South Korea have a common security threat. Rather, the commitment of the United States to protect the two allies, that is actually the defining factor. So when the United States decided to withdraw from East Asia, and when Japan and South Korea have shared understanding of US policy, for example, abandonment or entrapment, then the two countries cooperate. That is the discussion by Victor Cha. But in this case, actually, so every time North Korea conducted nuclear tests, the United States clearly mentioned that it has committed to protect the allies. So in this sense, the United States policy is a constant factor. So it cannot say that the US policy change can explain the security cooperation level during this period. And there are two other alternative explanations of cooperation and conflict between the two countries. Both of them are stimulated by the quasi-alliance model. The first one is called net threat perception theory. This theory argued that conflicts between Japan and South Korea are likely to occur when the net threat perceptions of each country diverge, while the incentive for cooperation between Japan and South Korea increases when their net threat perception converge. Another explanation proposed by Professor Park Cho-hee, Seoul National University, a Japan expert, he proposed the convergence management hypothesis. So when the threat perception of the respective countries converge and historical animosity has not escalated, then cooperation is likely to occur. In contrast, when the threat perception of each country diverges, and history animosity has escalated, conflict is likely to occur. In sum, both theories actually focus on convergence or divergence of threat perceptions. But again, my argument is different from all the three alternative explanations in following two aspects. Number one, Japan and South Korea had actually common symmetrical threat perceptions regarding North Korea's nuclear program and missile development after both the third and fourth nuclear tests. So constant, they shared symmetrical threat perceptions. So symmetrical or as asymmetrical threat perception does not explain the different level of security cooperation during this period. Secondly, the United States expressed its commitment to protecting its two allies from the North Korean threat following the third and fourth nuclear test, which means different from the argument of Victor Chair, the commitment of the United States is not a defining factor to explain different level of security cooperation. So, in sum, the existing theories seem to be unable to explain the dynamic mechanism of stagnation promotion in security cooperation between Japan and South Korea. So my argument is to offer a different explanation, including two factors, a combination of strategic priorities and also management of historical issues. Okay, just for your reference, I just mentioned that during the first 3 years of the President Park Geun-hye administration, South Korea emphasized what three-way approach over U.S. ROK Japan cooperation. This shows that how many meetings and dialogues South Korean government had with the United States and China and Japan. I counted all these meetings from diplomatic white paper published by Ministry of Foreign Affairs South Korea, and the numbers inside is actually indicate a number of summit meetings, including telephone calls. So surprisingly, the first 3 years of the Park administration, President Park had twice as much as summit meeting with China than with the United States, at that time President Obama. with the United States, 4 summit meetings, including phone calls with Xi Jinping. President Park had 8 summit meetings. With Japan, Prime Minister Abe, President Park had only once during the first 3 years. So it shows that one of the aspects that South Korea emphasized relationship with China rather than traditional allies or traditional trilateral cooperation. That's basically all about my presentation, but I'd just like to make one quick comment. As you mentioned, recently it seemed like Japan is reluctant to develop a cooperation with South Korea, and Japan has not even discussed U.S. allocate Japan traditional cooperation in dealing with North Korean issues. Rather, it seems that the Japanese government has more interest in promoting Indo-Pacific strategy, including Quad strategies and active cooperation with the United States. Well, the position of Japanese government is very clear. I'm not sure, even though I'm not sure it is the correct way, unless the South Korean government has positive, from Japan's perspective, changes regarding history issues. Japan is not going to change or either have summit meeting or promote cooperation with South Korea, just like President Park a few years ago had a similar attitude toward Japan. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. That's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nakato. I hope, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because I've seen vibrations here. Thank you, Professor Nakato, for having giving us such a detailed explanation of how you saw the period of 2013 and 17 through the lens of the theoretical aspect that you took into account. Discussions, I'm sure, is going to be, concerning Japan ROK relationships with respect to the current nature that we are seeing right now. What I would like to ask you through the presentation that you've done, in the discord factor, you do bring in the historical issues and the nuclear program of North Korea. How would you position China factor within the, the framework that you've created to study the ROK and Japan's relationship? I would also like you to throw some light, I think, during the entire conversation on the respect of how you expect the relationship to move forward, considering in certain areas of economics, we are seeing a strong progress to come together because of, in a sense, containing China or trying to find a second alternative, supply chain initiative, etc. So if you could also throw light on this, which is, I think, not really been part of your presentation, but I'm sure that, we will gain a lot from your views on these two aspects. I have already people who have raised hands. Would you like to first answer my queries, or would you like to go on to getting queries from other, participants in this webinar?
Okay, thank you very much for your very insightful questions. I'd like to answer one by one.
Yeah.
China factors. China factor is probably one of the most defining perceptual difference between Japan and South Korea. So Japan tends to see China as more threat than South Korea. If I say so, South Korean conservative people do not agree, but the threat perception over China, it seems different between Japan and South Korea. I do not argue that South Korea does not perceive a China threat, but dealing with China threat is different between these two countries. So Japan tend to focus more on US Japan security alliance, and Japan actually in the past wanted South Korea to be a part of it. So trilateral cooperation in dealing with China or Indo-Pacific strategy as well. On the other hand, South Korea, as you already noticed, does not want to take hostile attitude against China. So South Korea maintains, in a way, ambivalent position, try to be nice to China and nice to the United States. South Korea does not want to take a position between the United States and China. So that a different approach regarding China. That also, as you mentioned, makes the two countries to cooperate, even dealing with North Korean issues as well. So that probably applied to the question of economic cooperation between South Korea and Japan as well. And actually, for example, in the question of semiconductor issues, there are many space and areas for both countries to cooperate. However, South Korea and Japan emphasize more on competition in dealing with economic issues than cooperation, unfortunately. So current Moon Jae-in government emphasize more on cooperation in the field of economy with the United States and China rather than Japan. And Japan also takes such an attitude that, well, with that South Korea's cooperation, Japan can pursue different way, meaning cooperation with the United States. So in the question of economic cooperation, I assume that if history issues are resolved, probably Japan and South Korea have more space to cooperate, so which is a little bit different from China factors. I'm not sure how much I can answer to your questions, but I stop here.
It definitely gives us an understanding, and I think there is a lot of scope for engaging in this particular area academically. So let me move on to the questions from the audience. We have Yogendra Kumar ji, who's raised hands. May I ask you to introduce yourself as well as ask your question?
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating presentation. My question actually is perhaps...
Could you speak up a little, please?
Am I audible?
Not particularly. A little. You're not very audible.
Okay, let me change my... I'll ask the question later in that case.
We'll move on to Professor Mishra. He's raised his... Yeah.
Hello. I think I'm okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Nakato. It's a pleasure to see you in ICS webinar. So actually, he told me so many good things about you, and definitely your presentation was very good. I really enjoyed it. The first point I wanted to make, which we discussed actually, you already told that the threat perception from South Korea and Japan looks slightly different. In South Korea, the immediate problem is North Korea, and to deal with North Korea, they try to avoid actually looking at the bigger picture, that is China. And if they look at China, they try to use it actually, as you are saying, trying to be ambivalent, working economically with China and security strategy-wise with US. So they have been trying to deal with that. One thing which comes to my mind, that rather than basically, like you talked about two different phases or three different phases, and how Japan, South Korea, their strategic understanding about North Korean nuclear issue. my basic premise is that why not take ideological orientation? Because when I look at South Korean administrations, whenever a progressive administration comes, they have a softer position towards North Korea. They want dialogue with North Korea. And suppose what happened during Park Geun-hye, Lee Myung-pak, Park Geun-hye, and Moon Jae-in, we have a very clear distinction that actually trying to reach out North Korea, trying to, especially even Park Geun-hye, she had also a policy of trust building with North Korea, trust politics. Maybe it's not very well operationalized. And in contrast, from 2012, Japan under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, they had a strong position vis-a-vis North Korean nuclear issue. So my thing is that it's basically the basic political orientation of ruling regime in South Korea or Japan. That makes the difference of opinion, actually their discord, or you can say cooperation on strategic issue vis-a-vis North Korean nuclear issue. And I would not like to differentiate historical issues and strategic issues, because I will see that, look, historical issues are the foundation of good or bad between Japan and South Korea. It is not going to go away in, you can say in immediate future. So it's going to be there in the given historical, you can say, problematic situation. How actually I would rather divide, which earlier people used to feel that Japan and South Korea, even if they are having lots of historical problems, lots of strategic, even some kind of mismatch, but still they have separated their economic, people to people connect, and other cultural, you can say, even language learning, people going from Korea, K-pop and J-pop becoming popular. Unfortunately, in 2019, when Japan decided to remove South Korea from whitelist, people say that that was a big step, because the line was basically, because even if discord in one segment, economy, strategy and history issues, cooperation in economics and cultural exchange, they were there. So that was basically, and is it possible, do you agree with that, that this divide was workable, and breaking of that divide is going to create lots of problem in future with South Korea relations? So these are some small points I wanted to make. Thank you very much anyway.
Okay, shall I respond to your question or comments? Well, thank you very much. I'm pretty sure you are informed on this issue and expert on Korean issues. So your question is very much specific, and I actually learned a lot from your questions. I completely agree with the assessment of the first issue, meaning ideological orientation of the South Korean government. Yes, I could, well, other scholars also could focus on what kind of government is actually taking power in deciding their perception of North Korea and China as well. But that's completely true, and I agree. Conservative government and the progressive government, their understanding of North Korean issues are completely different, and that clearly influence their policy over the issue. But interestingly, for example, the reason why I focus on the issue of strategic priority is because even if South Korean conservative government, such as President Park, the first 3 years and the last 2 years, their approach is different. So the same government, same ideology, but their approach is can be different, of course. And the same thing applied to the Moon Jae-in government as well. I would say reluctantly, the first year of the Moon Jae-in government, I would say they joined more pressure-oriented approach against North Korea, because North Korea kept conducting nuclear tests. So therefore, pressure is more emphasized over dialogue and trilateral cooperation, meaning US, South Korea, Japan, are emphasized even the first year of the Moon administration. But 2018, a chance came, so yeah, they came back to the original position as a progressive government. So yes, one way, maybe focusing on ideological aspect of the Tasmanian government can be a good theme of research. But in this presentation, I just focused on different strategic priority because even the same government take a different kind of approach dealing with North Korea. That's one. And also the question of Japanese economic, the so-called sanction on South Korea. I agree. I mean, this is a completely improper policy in my understanding. Japan, in my understanding, was not supposed to take such hard harsh policy toward South Korea. That is completely coming from lack of understanding of the political situation in South Korea because focusing on Samsung, which is pride of South Korea and can also in the long run affect Japan's own supply chain. I do not think that it's a proper way for the Abe administration to take such actions. And even though they say this had nothing to do with a Supreme Court decision of over forced labor issues, but I mean, even Prime Minister Abe himself, and he mentioned that, I mean, this is actually related to each other. So no one believed that this is purely conducted based on WTO rule. It is actually their political intention is clear to retaliate South Korea over history issues. But one point, probably the politicians or leaders in Japan can think this approach was positive is because they consider that economic sanction is clearly sent a message that this time Japan will never compromise over history issues. That is a clear message to South Korea. And I would assume that many political leaders in Japan, they consider that this approach has been successful. So that's why the Moon administration, gradually, they are changing their original position to moving towards the Japanese demand. But I'm not really sure the reason why the Moon administration slightly changed its position is because economic sanctions, but it could be understood in such a way among political leaders in Japan. And yes, that's right. I mean, cooperation between Japan and South Korea, it is very, very important in many ways in economic field, culture and social, in many, many ways, not only dealing with North Korea and China, but yes, I mean, Japanese position is very, very stubborn at this moment, unless South Korea takes some positive action moving toward Japan. Japan is not going to promote any cooperation. So this is the strategy. Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you. Yogendra Kumarji?
Thank you. Am I audible now?
Yeah, very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor. I think it was a fascinating and stimulating presentation. And I think basically, I mean, in a way, you answered the question that I had in mind. Because in regard to North Korean nuclear program, the South Korean approach and Japanese approach is quite different. So South Koreans are looking at it in a purely very limited sense in terms of either unification or certain détente between the two countries and perhaps bring them closer through economic cooperation. whereas Japan is looking at it in larger political order in the Asia Pacific, or the Pacific region. So I think that's where the approaches to the North Korea's nuclear program actually varies, and that is where China comes in, because both countries look at China from different point of view from that way. The only thing I can say here is that why this kind of a strategic convergence is a little difficult to achieve is the wavering position of the US administration. Sometimes they feel that they can actually achieve some level of, if not complete denuclearization, but certainly you have the sort of have a proper peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. Whereas Japan would certainly want that there should be complete denuclearization of North Korea. And in one way, I think this unequal balance, which actually North Korea is taking advantage for their own purposes, that unequal balance, I think both sides are in a position to live with, because they feel that there is an opening for them to South Korea, Japan, and China to actually develop their closer economic cooperation. But even the position is different, because Japan is now talking about resilient value chain, whereas South Korea is not taking such a clear-cut position on that. So I think in one way, this is going to continue so long as I imagine the US administration is clear in its mind as to how they need to actually approach towards North Korea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful comment. I'm not going to, well, because it's not really a question, I'm not
Yes.
really answering your question, but I'd like to make maybe 2 points regarding what you mentioned. The question of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Yes, as you clearly mentioned, the understanding between Japan and South Korea on this issue is different, especially current Moon Jae-in administration. In Japan, most security and diplomacy experts, and maybe most of them in the Japanese administration, they are suspicious of the intention of North Korean denuclearization. They don't believe what North Korea mentioned. But on the other hand, if I'm wrong, Professor Sandeep, many liberal scholars in South Korea, I'm not really sure they really believe, but at least they understand what North Korea mentioned about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. If I ask the same question to conservative scholars in South Korea, they would take almost similar understanding in the issue of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But liberals, they say, if I ask the same question, if North Korea really intended to denuclearize, the answer is basically, they don't say yes clearly, but it's a kind of stupid question, because we are in a position to promote or to urge North Korea to denuclearize. So, but basically the approach is based on the assumption that North Korea might denuclearize if certain conditions are met. But many conservatives in South Korea and many scholars in Japan, they are suspicious. I mean, this is only a posture to get some kind of benefit by telling counterpart saying that North Korea is going to denuclearize. So this kind of a different understanding over the question of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, that yes, clearly the two countries difficult to cooperate. And also the understanding of the Korean Peninsula is also different. In Japan, as you clearly mentioned, the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is clearly meaning that the denuclearization of North Korea. But in South Korea, the context is slightly different. They are talking about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which means that they have to discuss about security regime of the Korean Peninsula at the same time when they talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The current U.S. administration, it seems they are skillfully differentiate their attitude with Japan and South Korea. When the United States and Japan met, 2+2 meeting or summit meeting in last month, their statement clearly mentioned, there means US, Japan 2+2 statement clearly mentioned that the denuclearization of North Korea. On the other hand, 2+2 statement issued, 2+2 statement, US allocate 2+2. Their statement mentioned denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So the United States just, differentiate its understanding, taking into consideration two allies' different understanding of the issue. So yes, the U.S. administration, we have to think about that factor is probably most defining because it seems like Biden administration is taking step-by-step approach and does not hope to complete denuclearization through summit meeting, but they start with arms control approach. It takes time, which may Japan be in a position a little bit uncomfortable compared to current South Korean administration. I stop here and thank you very much for your comments.
Thanks. And we move on to the next question by Vice Admiral Murugan.
Thank you, ma'am. My question, thank you, Professor Nakato, for that. Mine is slightly linked, and I have another question which may sound a little hypothetical. The first is how does South Korea view the Quad and its development, considering that both Japan and US are linked to it, and how do you view it as a security angle, or how do you look at it? The other one, you may smile it off, it may be sounding hypothetical, but taking a leaf out of Germany, do you ever see a unification between North and South Korea? Thank you.
Okay, so let me clarify your past question. So you are talking about, could you repeat again the past question?
The Quads, the cooperation, the Quad, okay. Cooperation and exercises and all that they do.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful questions. Regarding the question of Quad, Japan is very positive because Japan is one of the initiators of this framework, and Japan would like to promote Quad and also within the framework of its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which is also originally promoted by the Japanese government. But on the other hand, again, South Korea does not want to, or at least they are very careful about being a part of Quad, and also, yes, again, in the Pacific strategy, because again, they are concerned about negative response from China if Quad is clearly becoming hostile to China. So recently, many conservatives in South Korea, after the Biden administration started, the content of the Quad discussions are not really like military issues over focusing on China, but rather they are talking more about COVID-19 or like healthcare or environmental issues. If the Quad is not hostile to China, or just to promote security cooperation, not targeted at China. It is probably possible for South Korea to think about the possibility to be a part of it, not like clear positive member, but maybe as a, what should I say, maybe observer. That could be an initial stage for them to think about. But in, Japan's position is very clear. Yes, Japan is actively like to promote of a Quad. But the question is, still, this is an initial stage. It's not really like a security and military alliance kind of framework. This is just a study how they promote the question of Quad. And the question of unification of the Korean Peninsula, first of all, the issue is a question of Korean people, both South and North, and Koreans overseas. So they have to agree that Korean unification need to be accomplished. So yeah, in principle, still many people, I assume that they hope to see unification of the Korean Peninsula. But the question is how they accomplish this long-term goal over the methodology to be unified. It's kind of difficult for them to agree. So that probably takes many years. And also many people in Korea, especially in the South, they know that unless international society agree and international society support, it is difficult for the two countries to separate the nation to be unified again. So they try to get international support as well. But again, the question is, what kind of unification is going to be achieved? For example, from the perspective of Japan, if a unified Korea maintain nuclear weapons, and also if a unified Korea is too close to China, for example, and it maintains anti-Japan sentiment, such unified North Korea would not be welcomed from the perspective of Japan. I mean, this is a little bit like extreme scenario, but again, my point is what kind of unification is going to be promoted. That would be the issue, not only for Korean people, but also international society as well. Thank you very much for your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few questions in the chat box, and moving back to the Indo-Pacific, the much talked about world theater today. We have a question from Simran Walia, seeking your understanding of how you look at this relationship and keeping in mind that the Chinese aggressive behavior in the region.
Okay. Yes. Sometimes even the Japanese government may not be clear on this point, but the real issue is, of course, about China. That's probably no question about that. So Quad, Indo-Pacific strategies, they are they are talking about many issues, not only Chinese issues, but also more broader issues as well. But imminent concern is, of course, coming from the threat of China. Okay.
I think we've lost connectivity, Nakato Sensei.
Okay, it's coming a little bit, yes. So from Japan's perspective, Indo-Pacific strategies need to be promoted with the cooperation with the United States. So U.S.-Japan Security Alliance is a core of Indo-Pacific strategy in Japan's foreign policy, and Quad is also a part of it to promote Indo-Pacific cooperation. That's probably a basic principle.
One more question. This is from Shamshad Khan. He appreciates the way you have defined and went ahead with your presentation on the South Korea-Japan relations. He says that he would like to point out the final year syndrome that Japan and South Korea relations usually have. And currently, since President Moon is in his last year, do you think that it is definitely making a difference to the relationship, especially because he's been pretty different in his approach towards Japan than his predecessors?
Okay, so connection stable.
Yeah. Were you able to get the question in place?
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, you can see it also, but basically to ask whether the current reluctance of Japan, is it because of the final year syndrome of President Moon, or is it also to do with the fact that he's handled or looks at Japan differently from his predecessors?
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Yes, many Japanese people believe that that is because of President Moon. But on the other hand, many people in South Korea think that that is because of Prime Minister Abe. So their understanding is completely different. So both of them, they are just waiting for the change of administration. So many people in Japan, they expect next president in South Korea, maybe from conservative. And on the other hand, so well, that actually happened. Many people in South Korea, they are just waiting for the former Prime Minister Abe to quit. Then the situation might change. But it may change a little bit, but fundamental issues are not actually resolved or will not be properly treated in Japan, at least. Because many Japanese people, at least right now, they think that Japan has already done enough. Korea demanding the same issues, or especially from the perspective of Japanese people, including government officials, the Supreme Court ruling of a comfort woman issue, and also forced labor issue. That cannot be accepted from Japan's perspective, because from their understanding, that is that all resolved after Japan and South Korea normalized. That is probably the bottom line of the Japanese government position. So therefore, Japan is in this issue very, very stubborn, no compromise on this issue. In the past, Japan eventually made some kind of a concession toward South Korea's demand, but this time, no. That is basic position of Japan. So as somebody mentioned, yes, especially during the period of Prime Minister Murayama in 1990s, is probably the peak of Japanese people to be more understandable to the issue of history. So a lot of development were, in Japan's perspective, a compromise towards South Korea's demands. But now, yes, there are some aspects that Japan is more getting conservative in understanding history issues. And also, again, this is probably the bottom line or margin line to the question of history issues. So even though the administration changed, but the question still continue, I think, unfortunately.
We have one more question from Gaurav Datta. It's linked to the answer that you've been answering in the previous question. It says out here whether you think that if it's not the LDP party in power and a different party, will that make a difference? And I think you can see the following question again. Shamshad Khan has said about whether the change of presidency, or probably out here again, the change of party will make any difference to this relationship.
Yes, makes some difference, but probably it's kind of difficult to solve. I mean, this issue. This issue means the question over forced labor issues and also comfort women issues. But interestingly, a few days ago, different from Supreme Court ruling, local court decided that a kind of political constellation. So it may give some incentive or impetus for the Moon administration to take issue politically, even though they had maintained the position that history and law is, politics and law have separate issues, but they may take some action. But from Japan's, the Japanese side, very stable, no change. I'm actually, yes, surprisingly they are stable on this issue. So I clearly see that the position of Japan is no compromise on this issue.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question, either through the chat box or raising your hands? Thank you, Professor Nakato-san, for engaging with us on a subject that is pretty complex and has alternative views in place. And it's been indeed interesting to hear your positions and Japan's concerns that emits from the relationship that Japan has with South Korea and therefore in the East Asia region. I would like to hand over to the Director of Institute of Chinese Studies, Ashok Kanta, for his final remarks.
Thank you very much, Nakato-san, for that excellent presentation, for putting across a very cogent construct for explaining ups and downs and vicissitudes in relations between Japan and South Korea. And you engaged in discussions on a whole range of issues, which we appreciate. On the whole, I think it was a very, very productive seminar for which we owe our thanks to both the speaker and the chair. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful question and comment and stimulating discussions. And I hope someday in the future, when the COVID-19 situation get better, I hope promote some kind of academic exchange between your institute and also our institute in Japan.
We look forward to that, and we look forward to receiving you in person also in India when things improve.
That's right. Good. I'd like to invite you all to Kyoto too.